let us begin by agreeing that this parable is super fun and extremely difficult. The only thing that scholars have a consensus about is that there is no consensus about how to interpret it. There seems to be information left out about what the manager is actually doing that's dishonest. The statements of Jesus seem to lead in a multiplicity of directions that are not easy to interpret. What is dishonest wealth? Why commend it? And so it comes down as this sort of very difficult interpretive kind of task. And so for that reason, there being very little consensus, and I know that usually parables are open to a multiplicity of interpretations. That's part of the joy of a good story. This one is just particularly different and difficult in how it gets interpreted. So I'm going to offer you 3 avenues for how you might think about it today. So the first avenue, we might call it the one about economic undermining. There's a way in which perhaps the manager has been squandering the master's money by sort of being a Robin Hood, all right? Here's what I mean. We have to cast our minds back to the 1st century and imagine that we know that masters who lend out things do so at an incredible interest rate. 50% interest rate, right? So if you think about that, that creates crippling debt, absolutely crippling debt. And you'll remember that the law actually prohibits usury. So open question as to whether anyone should actually be charging interest in the first place. And so these people who owe the master, a lot of what they owe is interest on whatever it is they borrowed. And the interest, of course, wouldn't necessarily come in the form of money. It would come in the form of more oil or more wheat. And so perhaps what it is that the manager has been doing is sort of cooking the books slightly to give more money back. And then when he's caught, what he does is go to extreme measures. There's a way in which you can read that when he hacks the person's, oil in half, he's actually just giving them back their original debt without the interest. Same is true for the wheat. And so he becomes this kind of figure who robs from the rich to give to the poor, hence the Robin Hood. And in doing so, kind of points out the economic problem and the sort of depravity of a system that keeps some people up and crushes other people. And there's consistency in that with Jesus. In Luke, Jesus has a lot to say about wealth on a pretty consistent basis. And he's pretty critical of any kind of system that keeps some people up and some people down, because of course everyone is a beloved child of God. And so perhaps what Jesus is commending the manager for is this kind of economic inversion, that he finds a kind of loophole and begins to subvert how the world works. In which case then, what comes down to us, perhaps for our own contemplation of the text, is what are the things in our own world that do not make for human flourishing? How are we complicit in systems that advantage some and crush others? What responsibility do we have in the public square? Where is the intersection of this faith with politics or with economics? What does that mean for us? What is Jesus calling us to? Avenue 1. Avenue 2 you might call, I don't know, I'm bad at giving things names. This is why we have other people do that here. But relationship reciprocity, okay? So when you open the parable, there's a sense that the relationships are all one-sided. The master and the manager have power over everyone who owes a debt, right? Because they owe it. They're indebted. It's not a kind of reciprocal relationship at all. It's one of debt to debt collector. But what the manager does in distributing out sort of the wealth back is that he raises those folks up. And now his relationship to them is far more reciprocal. It's less over-under than sort of a reciprocal relationship in which he has somehow redistributed wealth to them. Now, I think that's complicated because he does it in order to ingratiate himself to them, right? I mean, he's like, I can't dig. oh, I don't want to beg. I know, I'll use this money to make friends for myself who will then house me and feed me when I'm fired. So he does create this kind of dependent relationship. But there's kind of an argument to be made that at least he undermines the kind of over-under and attempts to bring people back into more equal relationship. And that would also be fairly consistent with what Jesus teaches about relationships between people. That, to have something over another person is always to sort of be in a manipulative position. It's to have power over. And this is, of course, never how we see Jesus operate. He comes to serve others. He calls his followers to not be first, but to be last. He believes in sort of that everyone is a beloved child of God, equally beloved of God, equally worthy of dignity, respect, and human flourishing. And so if the story is about kind of this equality of relationships, then the question is how do we do that? Who do we sort of have power over individually in our lives? Or society because of what we look like or who we are? And how is it then that we do something to make those relationships less over-under, power over, and more relationships of sharing? So that we bring the gospel to bear in our personal lives and in systems. The third kind of interpretive lens you might use is the lens of faithfulness and trustworthiness. So what Jesus commends the manager for, and what even the guy who fires him commends the manager for, is shrewdness. Wisdom is the other translation. I mean, shrewd has the edge of canniness, and what the manager does is pretty canny, right? I mean, he ends up with his back up against the wall, and he comes up with a pretty good solution to get himself out of it. I mean, even though he's just lost a ton of money, his master sort of has to give him credit, right? Game recognizes game a little bit here, right? The manager manages to make a wise solution. And it's consistent with who the manager has been his whole life. There's something deeply dishonest about the manager. You wouldn't want to employ someone who's cheating you all the time. That's what this person has done. He's cheated all along the way. Somehow he's cheated all along the way, the master. Small. Didn't get noticed for a while. But then when he gets caught, he decides to cheat with abandon, right? Just cutting people's debts right and left. If you're dishonest with a little, you will be dishonest with a lot. If you're not trustworthy with something that belongs to somebody else, probably gonna not have any of your own, right? Because you've been dishonest. And that, of course, is how it works out for the man in the story. He was dishonest with property that wasn't his. He doesn't get any of his own property by the end of it, right? And so there's a sort of sense of Jesus doing this argumentation of from the lesser to the greater. Look, even if this dishonest person, at least he had a bizarre kind of integrity in his dishonesty, how much more so when people, should the children of light be honest and trustworthy when things are entrusted to them? When the children of light, or Jesus' followers, have their back up against the wall, are they trustworthy with what's been given them? Do they maintain their integrity in the face of that? There's a sense that what's been entrusted to the followers of Jesus isn't monetary wealth. It's the keys to the kingdom. It's the good news of the gospel. And how is it that Jesus' followers are trustworthy with it? Do we continue to steward it well, even when it feels like culture is out of step with us, which is always? Does it, through all time, right? Do in our personal lives, when it feels like we're caught, do we continue to try to be trustworthy and faithful with sort of our own honesty, with our own gospel intentions? There's something wise about that, a grounded wisdom. And as Jesus says in other places, it seems like, if you're trustworthy when it's not that big of a situation, then the next time maybe you're entrusted with more, and with more, and with more, with the kind of true riches of the gospel message and the gospel text. And so then the story becomes a question of, what does it mean to be wise for the sake of the gospel? What does it mean to be trustworthy and consistent with the gospel message in every part of our lives? The public aspect of it and the private aspect of it. How do we live in a trustworthy manner? I don't know that I particularly find any of those interpretations 100% compelling. I'm happy if you do. But I'm not sure that I find them completely satisfying. Which leads me to this sort of broader sort of maybe avenue of gospel interpretation is that's like, what do you do when the parable leaves you unsatisfied? When the story in Scripture is actually really difficult to interpret? It's a reminder that we never pull out one verse or one story, right? Because we have the whole canon. It speaks with multiplicity for a reason. Thank God that we have 4 Gospels. They all tell us something different about Jesus, right? Thank goodness we don't just have this parable. In interpretive lenses, we use other pieces of Scripture to understand it, to help us understand what God is saying in this. But it is this reminder that, we try to grasp after Jesus and contain his meaning, and we simply can't. His holiness is actually beyond our reach. And so what is faithful about struggling with these difficult pieces of Scripture? It seems to me there's something about wrestling with the unknownness of this that perhaps bears its own fruit, that has its own faithfulness in it. And do we believe that Scripture actually has something to say with us even when it's opaque, that the Spirit still speaks? I think that's the conviction I come to you today with. I couldn't land on an interpretation. I had to offer you 3. That's not normative, but there it is. But I trust that the Spirit of God, even in these passages of Scripture that are tough, calls us beyond ourselves. That the Spirit offers something to each one of us today that is ours in the way that God does. So may we listen, and may the Spirit say to God's people what the Spirit wants to say, and may we hear what God is calling to us today, even in the most strangest of parables.